Greetings, folks. Welcome back to the joint webinar for HERDSA and ASCILITE SIGs. Priya, would you like to introduce the speaker today? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Matthew, and welcome everyone to the second part of the webinar today. And it's such a huge honor to welcome Professor Peter Bryant. Peter is a professor of business education at the University of Sydney Business School. And Peter is also a visiting professor at King's Business School and King's College London, with over 30 years of teaching and research experience both in UK and Australia. Peter specializes in strategic educational change in business and social science, focusing on higher education, innovation, online learning, and creative industry management. Previously, Peter has also held leadership roles at the London School of Economics, the University of Greenwich, and Middlesex University. And Peter serves as editor in chief of Research in Learning Technology. He is also co director of Academy of Management, and he is the Director of Disruptive Innovations in Business Education Research Group at the University of Sydney. And today, Peter is going to engage us in the concept of third spaces that emerge when the institutions and individual take positions around these debates that are emerging in the light of AI. So, very warm welcome, Peter, and over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Priya. Let me just share my screen so that people can see it. It is that one there. Perfect. Hopefully everyone can see my screen. I'll just put that into presentation mode. Continue share. So hopefully everyone can see my screen. Is that right?
Yes, we can see. Thanks.
Marvelous. Excellent. Thank you very much for the invitation, Priya. Thank you very much to David for his talk. It was really, really interesting, and I think has some strong connections into what I'm going to be talking about. Before I start, I will just acknowledge that the University of Sydney is on the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. We also have campuses all around on other First Nations lands, and I want to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. So I start this with a fairly obvious assertion that life is pretty complex, right? So we're dealing with a complex sector that we're in that is experiencing significant challenge around financial considerations, international students and the demonization of international students, changing government policy, changing industry requirements. Life is pretty complex. What complexity does, though, for the people that are caught up in it, is it challenges how we are able to manage competing interests. So when we've got a whole range of complex issues impacting on the way in which we engage in higher education, the capability for us as academics or as educational developers or as learning technologists to look at multiple things at once become increasingly compressed. Because what it does is it fractures certainty. And when certainty is fractured, people feel precarious, people feel worried about their futures, and it often creates situations of paradox, so paradoxical decision making. What that leads to is challenges in how we react to a particular circumstance. And those circumstances are the crises that we face. And I pose the question, do these crises ever end? Because if we look at the way higher education has been over the last decade or so, we have been beset by concurrent, consecutive, and ongoing crisis. You can count the pandemic, you can talk about the financial crisis, you can talk about the demonization of international students, the list goes on. And we rarely have the time to reflect and heal from the previous crisis before we are facing the next crisis, that we are going to have to all bring ourselves together in a sense of collective bonhomie in order to try and address now what is the biggest existential crisis we've ever faced since the last one we faced a year ago. And we can see this in the headlines across the world. I've just picked a rough sample here of various headlines that look at the impacts of AI, the financial crises that are impacting universities in Australia, such as Macquarie, ANU, Western Sydney, UTS, the change in the way university leadership wants to run their universities, and there's obviously been the governance review into Australian universities from the federal government, which has talked about how we have to change the way university governance runs to what's been happening in the UK and Europe around the hiring of more CEO-like vice chancellors in an era where nearly a third of the universities are experiencing financial concerns, to some of the changes that are happening in the US, of course, where universities are not able to get access to funds unless they sign on to an accord, if you will, but more likely a compact to agree to promote conservative values. All of this is happening in universities around the world. I was just talking to colleagues here in Germany yesterday, because I'm doing some work with the university here in Berlin. And whilst they are government funded, the government that is funding them here in Berlin, which is the state government, the state that Berlin's in, has now experienced 2 periods of bankruptcy in the last 10 years, which means that whilst every student gets access to the university for free, the funding that is surrounding them is compromised. And that affects buildings, it affects capital, and the hiring of staff. This is a headline that came out of the Financial Times a few weeks ago here in the UK, which says universities are doomed and it's terrible, but there's a silver lining. And his silver lining is this, that whilst it's never nice predicting the termination of thousands, perhaps millions of jobs as an entire industry goes down the U-bend, but there comes a time when a better truth must be faced and a potential silver lining, which is the ending of the university sector. Now, I will grant the Telegraph, for those of you who don't know, the paper is a fairly right-wing paper, and this is a fairly right-wing dog whistle. But what's really interesting about it, and whilst it is an extreme example of the particular crisis that we're facing, it is part of the narrative that is appearing. Just pardon me for a second, I just need to... That's better. It is part of the narrative that we are facing. So with all of that, with the complexity around and the crisis that we're facing, we now have to embrace and cope with AI in our assessments. And that's what we're being told. My university, University of Sydney, is a very AI-forward, AI-first university. I know other universities in Australia are attempting that process of the fact that they want AI to be at the very forefront of what they do. It needs to be taught to every student in every unit. Every assessment needs to assess AI skills and capabilities. That is fundamental to a lot of the way universities are approaching it. It is embedded in part in the way TEXA in Australia, our regulator, for those of you who are not from Australia, have created guidance around both the use of AI in assessment and the use of AI in programs. And this burden of this, the redesigning of programs, the redesigning of assessment, the redesigning of the way in which we teach, falls on us. Whilst there is policy around it, the actual work burden, the intellectual burden, falls on us and it falls on the students. And once again, we see this through numerous headlines around the world, around how AI is going to destroy integrative assessment, how 99.9% of students are using AI to write their essays, how it means the end of humanities education, which has historically relied on long-form writing, how the university is countering it with the use of exams. All of these things are really important in there. And of course, there are universities in the UK that have now appointed the Pro-Vice Chancellors for Artificial Intelligence. We're seeing an increasing number of what are called AI fellows being hired by universities to take specific roles around the deployment of AI in higher education. We're also seeing it across social media. I've just taken a small sample of hundreds of LinkedIn posts that I've cut and pasted over just the last 4 weeks. Patrick Dempsey, who's an educational developer from the US, says AI has killed assessment and there's nothing you can do about it. And he talks through a number of his views as to why that's the case. That created, as you can see on the right, quite a significant debate, including a probably slightly provocative comment from myself about the notion of what he's talking about as a dystopian fever dream. But it created a lot of debate and discussion. And he's not the only one who's made this. I've just picked Patrick's point, but there are a number of others across social media that have been making the point that AI has already killed assessment, and we now need to reimagine the entire architecture and ecosystem of what we do in assessment. Danny Liu from my university put on social media that he's very proud of the fact that they've banned the banning of AI in all non-observed assessments to reduce the fear and shame around the use of AI and give students more agency. That's been a very policy-driven approach at the University of Sydney, where we've deployed a two-lane approach where you either have assessments that are effectively invigilated and therefore AI can be used, but only with the direction of the teacher. So that is the assessments we trust, and that all other assessments, the teacher, the academic, cannot ban the use of AI or cannot say AI can't be used, which is an area which I've had some challenging and interesting discussions with the university on, because I strongly believe in the fact that academics should have agency, and so should students, which I'll talk about in a little bit. There's also James Hudson, who's from the US, who talks a lot about the fact that he believes unless you use AI, you are intellectually bankrupt. Because you are effectively a progenitor of the idea of what he calls an anti-AI academic alarmist. And he's written a piece with James Plate about this, Daniel Plate, sorry, about this, and it's been published in Teaching in Higher Education, which is an interesting debate point about the sort of criticality of where we are in terms of people's perceptions of AI and assessment. I put this one in here because this has just been the thing that's popped up in the last 10 days or so, which is the assertions of Sam Altman, the owner of OpenAI, that he plans to allow AI to ChatGPT to do adult content, porn, erotica, whatever you want to call it. A lot of the underpinning AI bot development at the moment, and this is from I think a really powerful researcher in the US who is trying to prevent harm to children through AI, and she just pointed out how easy it was to access and create deep fakes using AI nude apps, and I put this here because this is another part of the ethical challenge that we have with universities deciding we're AI first and using some of these platforms that have some challenging moral aspects that we ourselves need to debate. I'm not making the argument that we shouldn't use ChatGPT. I'm not making the argument we shouldn't use AI. I'm making the argument here that we need to have the debates about the products and practices that we are encouraging students to use as part of their transition and journey through assessment. The final set of ones I'll show are just some other ones which I find really interesting. The one on the right is a student who wanted to make sure that their law academic was aware that AI was not used in the production of their assessment. So this is the student making a declaration back to the teacher, unprompted, that I want to make you aware, Professor, that I did not use AI. The one on the left is a person this is an academic, I think an engineering academic from the US, and I had a long discussion with her about this piece, because her view was a student came to her and said, I don't want to use AI in my work, and she gave them less marks, because she said, unless you use AI, you're not preparing yourself for the real world. So we're getting some student-driven and student push on the fact that for them, it's not a homogeneous experience. That there are some students who don't want to use AI, there are some students who want to use it in a particular way, there are some students who see it as cheating, there are some students who see it as an easy pathway to submission, there are some students who use it in order to craft and develop and make a better argument. So it's being used in multiple ways, and these kind of assertions that were in the media that I showed earlier, around 99% of students are using it to cheat, are actually creating a bit of a fake argument that we need to have a discussion around. But what we cannot get away from is that in every part of higher education, all we're talking about is AI. And that goes back to that question of complexity. If we struggle to deal with multiple crises at the same time, we focus on the one crisis in front of us, and we're focusing primarily on AI. And that is, I mean, I've been traveling. I'm on sabbatical at the moment. I've been traveling around, doing various presentations around the UK and Europe for the last 2 months. And I can tell you now, in the dozens of universities that I've visited and worked with, the question of AI has come up in every single one of those conversations, without doubt. So what sometimes this actually forces us to do is take sides. Are we pro-AI or anti-AI? And because a lot of what I write is about criticality and actually trying to ask these critical questions, I get positioned really easily as, well, you're the anti-AI guy. You're the AI alarmist. You're the Luddite. You're rejecting what the world actually already knows is that AI is inevitable and we need to deal with it. But what I'm really interested in is actually the abundant between these polarized sides. And I've done a bit of work. I won't go through this in any great depth, but this is a model that I've been working on about what I mean by when I talk about the abundant between. You've got a lot of people who are true believers in AI, and I wouldn't say that is just because you use AI. True believers are people that believe that anyone who is to the right of them, if you follow the diagram, is actually is a resistance. They're resisting change. So there is no position other than AI being the only solution to every problem in a university. You've got people who are actually resistors, people who don't want to use AI. There are people who refer to it as generative AI. There is Cory Doctorow's work around enshittification. There's a lot of people who have written about AI as bullshit. There's a lot of narrative around AI resistance. Equally, a lot of anyone who's in that box thinks that anything to the left of them is actually just succumbing to hype. But the reality is the majority of us are in the middle here. But it gets harder and harder to do debate, reflection, criticality, adoption, experimentation, agency, and research in that middle space when you've got these polarized opposites pulling you in each direction. But that space in the middle, that abundant between in the middle, is exactly where all of the discussions about how AI can be used to make a better education are residing. But they are not where a lot of the policy or public discourse is residing, which is a challenging set of kind of polar forces that are preventing the actual debate and critical reflection that we need to have. I put these two up because I think they're both representative of some of these polar opposite debates. I love Miriam Reynoldson's diagram of it's inevitable because everyone's doing it. Therefore, we have to teach them because it's inevitable because everyone's doing it. So this kind of circular argument that often comes out of a lot of the nascent research that's being done, but also primarily the social media discourse. The AI-generated cartoon on the right, it's not mine, that is from someone else. And I like, once again, the sort of false equivalence that comes from this. Oh, yes, when an academic is using the work of others to write their work, they're standing on the shoulders of giants. But when the bot is using it as part of their training data, that's stealing. I find it a really interesting false equivalence because it isn't the same activity and it is not a different verdict. But these are the kind of things that are starting to appear in social media, in the debates that we're having, and it shows some real exemplars of that sort of polar opposite forces that makes the debate in the abundant between really hard to undertake. So I want to talk about integrity, criticality, and the role of the human in assessment. So let's start with the human capabilities that we develop and inspire through assessment. Assessment of learning is a really critical building block for the journey for students. Without assessment for learning, in other words, by that I mean, and we're all assessment experts, that people learn through doing assessment. This is not an assessment to get a grade. It is not an assessment to get the final contribution towards whether you pass or fail a unit. That's assessment of learning. I'm not diminishing that. It's really important. It is a fundamental role to our certification practices as higher education. What I am talking about is that the process of using assessment for learning. So it affords students the opportunity to have their learning validated. So, yep, I know I've learnt it, and I get the feedback that I've learnt it, that they've learned from failures and any missteps and successes. And how we do that, how we enable that, is through feedback. That is what feedback is used for. Now, once again, there's a massive debate about feedback. We know how well feedback is valued by students inside national student surveys, inside the Quilt data. We know it's almost always one of the lowest scores, no matter how much effort we put into it. We know we get that we don't give enough feedback, that the quality of the feedback is challenged. I've got a particular view on that, and like David, I think that's a whole nother talk around how we get our feedback in a way that is not a trade-off between the sort of marketized version of a university and what I would refer to as the sort of post-marketized university. But that's a talk for another day. To me, the critical human skills that are important are around connection, making connections. And that connection isn't with a chatbot. That connection with other humans, with the knowledge that people are learning, with the disciplines between academics and between the students' own networks. Importance of creativity and how creativity is used by students to come up with new and interesting problems to solve and new and interesting solutions to those problems. Criticality, how students actually are able to look at information and make a determination that information is accurate or not. Emotion, belief, curiosity, imagination, these are human skills. And to me, they are the fundamental building blocks of higher education. They should also be the fundamental building blocks of assessment. I found it really quite inspiring when David talked about the synoptic exam, and he said how excited the students were to do it, talking to the students beforehand. Show a student a normal exam and they're not particularly excited. They're fearful of it, in part because we've put a particular pressure on that and the cognitive load that comes from the pressure of, if you don't pass that exam, you don't pass the unit, must pass assessments and all those kind of things. But when we actually build an assessment process that engenders these things, puts these kind of human traits at the center of it, and not just memory, not just being able to regurgitate an argument, but be actually able to make connections and embed belief and embed curiosity in what we do, then that assessment generates learning. It creates a space for learning. My challenge here is that AI can't do these things. This is the things that humans add, and human education is important. However, we've also got to make the critical case that integrity is critical to what we do in assessment. Unless we can trust our assessments, we as institutions have no role. Part of what we are required to do under law, pardon me, part of what we're required to do under law, but part of what we are required to do morally as a university is we are graduating people with capabilities. Whether those capabilities are used now or used in the future, we're graduating people with capabilities. So this comes from the text advice from 2024, that their concerns are that unless we do something about AI, we are risking the trust and integrity in the assessments that we use in order to meet our legislative requirements. So they've obviously told universities they had to provide information back to them. They're now requiring universities to have policies and practices and processes in place to ensure the integrity of the assessment. So I definitely don't want to put integrity down as a minor issue here. It is existential to the structural survival of institutions. So, but then we get things like the varying versions of how institutions are doing that. And I've just picked a couple here from, these are, I think, mainly all from Times Higher. A lot of universities are saying, well, the simplest thing is we just go back to exams, or we do oral assessment, or we do, and I have heard in various institutions the discussion of removing grades from non-invigilated assessment, so that the non-invigilated assessment doesn't count towards the final, weighted average mark or average grade of the unit. So there's a lot of debate there around having to redesign the entire assessment process, the whole way in which we undertake assessment. But at the very core of that is this argument that, can we trust the assessment that is done? Can we trust the students to not use AI in order to gain an academic advantage? And I'm hesitating to use the parlance of cheating here because that's used a lot. But the response from universities to the challenges of our regulator is that we actually have to start thinking about the way our assessment processes are undertaken. And our default position has been for the last couple of years, and I'd love to hear from other institutions, but the default position that has come from my institution is we've moved back to exams. But I want to put at the heart of this that, and this is a very controversial argument, and I know that I will cop a little bit of grief about this because a lot of people have pushed back when I've said authentic assessment is part of this solution. There are a lot of people who talk about the post-authentic university. Carlo Okono from CSU did a piece recently around the post-authentic university. A lot of people have said that authentic assessment is irrelevant in the era of generative AI. I believe that authenticity is critical to human learning. Now, I will admit the term has been overused and misapplied, but the basic principles of it, which is that it creates meaning, it creates resonance, so you feel something, and it creates a purpose, are so important to differentiating memory from learning. So yes, you can assess and you can assess someone's memory. That's great. Learning is where, in that sense of authenticity, you actually feel like this has purpose and meaning. I understand this. It makes me angry. It makes me sad. It makes me happy. It makes me joyous. It makes me inspired to be an accountant or a engineer. The human emotion is linked to authenticity. So I do think authentic assessment is really important. I have over the years written a fair bit around redefining authentic assessment and putting it into the fact that it is meaningful and it recognizes the reflexive, uncertain, and uncanny experiences of students. So it's not about memory. It is about meaning. It's about reflexivity. It's about the fact that actually people learn by challenging how much they do know and challenge themselves to identify how certain they are in their knowledge. So, and it's situated inside the life experiences of students. In these writings, you can find these on the Disruptive Innovations in Business Education Research Group blog. I've talked about different types of authenticity, sort of authenticity of knowledge, authenticity of the experience, and authenticity of the education, or what we're trying to teach them, or what we're trying to engage them with. But really, authentic assessment in an era of generative AI is one of the ways in which we need to redesign our assessment, constructed as I've constructed it here, which is about that notion of meaning. I then want to talk about the human responsibility and agenda trust through assessment. This is a piece that I've just written on my own personal blog, peterbryant.org. You can find it there. And it's my argument that we should not be using AI to provide feedback to students. So if we make the argument that we want something that's authentic, it is to the benefit of the academic and the benefit of the student that the feedback that is created by them, for them. Now, obviously this is a blog, so I've used very colorful language here in noting that if we use AI for feedback, it's a carnival mirror. It's an amusing misperception of human form without substance, structure, or depth, because AI can't create meaning. The fundamental reason for that is AI can't ask why. So if you ask AI to create feedback, you can say, mark this against a rubric, and it can. But you can equally ask AI to mark and say, but I want you to mark this at a high distinction level. And it can create a wonderfully poetic, completely believable feedback to students based on that being a HD assignment. You can equally ask it to look at the exact same assignment and mark it as a fail. And it will come up with an exactly persuasive, beautifully constructed argument as to why that assignment is a fail against the rubric you've provided it. Because it doesn't ask why. Why do you think it's a HD? Why do you think it's a fail? No, it just wants to please you and give you those answers. So that's not going to have any meaning to students. Now, if that is simply a justification for the grade that a student gets in their assessment, that might have the meaning. But the reality is, feedback is the way in which we actually enable authenticity, because it's me reading, watching, observing a student's work and providing my reactions to that work. That's human. And what we also need to be considerate of is the notion of slop. Now, AI slop, for those of you who know the way it works, is the proliferation of low-quality media, polarized content that is then used to train the models of AI, and you end up with mistakes. Now, I do use the photo of the six-fingered lady here. That photo was in The Guardian, so that has been changed, courtesy of the fact that people picked it up. And now a lot of media now start to put that this image has been AI created on top of them. But the notion of slop is really important, because what you start to get is the proliferation of low quality educational content. A lot of AI theorists talk about that this is what will result in model collapse, where more and more and more AI is used to train the AI, and then that will actually generate more and increasing mistakes, and what Dirk Lindenbaum from the University of Bath refers to as losing focus on the truth. And we've just got data which we don't know which is right or wrong. So I made this as an example. I have a fake university that I use to do workshops with colleagues of mine from the UK and the US called the University of Bamford. We created a 3-week leadership course called Leading Through Polycrisis, entirely using AI. It's a live course. You can look at it on our website, unibamford.com. All the videos are created with AI. There's podcasts there created with Notebook LLM. All the content was created with AI. And whilst it looks on the surface quite persuasive, underneath, it's actually quite soulless. There's no human in there. Now, I will point out that there's a person who teaches crisis leadership. The prompts I asked AI would no doubt be informed by my expertise. But like, there's fake references in there. I know that's one of the bog standard ones that we talk about, but there's fake references in there. I was listening to the podcast yesterday with a colleague of mine here in Berlin, and I was okay, it sounds really professional, but there's just no human element to it. It is in some ways the definition of slop. And there's a really good example of a company in the UK called US called Turning Point, which makes 5,000 podcasts a week using AI. And I think for those of you who would have seen the Media Watch story on this in Australia on the ABC a few weeks back, their podcast on Sydney, on their travel guide to Sydney, the first one was really good. It had, good guides to Sydney. The second one had a number of restaurants that were fake. The third one started talking about the actress Sydney Sweeney, because it had run out of things to talk about. So what we found is the more detail we asked of it, the more it just ran out of things to say and started repeating itself or started making things up. Now, I put this here because I do know of circumstances where there are academics, I won't name institutions, that have created entire full programs for students without any critical thinking and just used AI because they thought, well, I can get it done in 2 hours rather than 13 hours of work. That's a dangerous circumstance to be in when you start to think about how that feeds into the development then of the next course and the next course and our approaches and conceptualizations of knowledge. So if AI writes the assignment for students, we use AI to mark it, the student has learned nothing. So if the students use it, if that's the model that we assume they are, or certainly the media is, then we use AI to mark it, then they've learned nothing. If the academic uses AI to write the assignment, the rubric, and mark the submission, they've learned nothing because they've received none of the feedback that reflects on their design or their teaching of that assessment. They are pleased but not informed, is something I'd written on a blog a few weeks ago. It is the vendor who learns and earns from handing assessment over to generative AI. It's not the student and it's not the teacher. And that kind of cycle of absence worries me considerably. And the final thing I just want to talk about, because I know I've run slightly over time, is that this is not something that is just a today problem. Generation Alpha are the next generation to come into higher education. They're due in higher education in 5 years' time. They are the first generation to be primarily born to millennial parents, not exclusively, but primarily. They've got a strong influence of social media and social connections. They have the very strong influence of their millennial parents, where over 50% of them do not value the time and money that they invested into their higher education. That has gone up from 20% in my generation, which is Gen X. So millennials, 50% believe that their higher education wasn't worth the money or time. That is what they are encouraging their own children to understand. And they're moving through their compulsory education in a very highly digital environment from a very young age and have immediate access to information. So what this leads to is some real differences in this particular generation. They will be our undergraduate students for the next 20 years. There's a strong sense of personalization and agency over learning. There's information, media and technological literacies and uses that are unique to this group. That is not that they're digital natives. I'm not making that argument in any way, shape, or form, just so I'm already going to get yelled at for authentic assessment, so I'll avoid the digital natives argument. That they've got very defined constructs of ethics, values, and relationships that are unique to their generation. They do non-linear and on-demand knowledge acquisition. In other words, they know how to find information quickly because that's what they've been brought up with. You know, they may have asked their mother or father, why is the sky is blue? Instead of what I got when I was a kid, well, that's the way God made the sky. The parents can now just pick up their phone and go, well, the sky is blue because of the way light reflects off the atmosphere. And they can explain it. There's immediate access to information. And there's some really challenging versions of senses of self. That's both selflessness and selfishness that are really unique to this generation. And in an era of AI, they will be exposed to AI in their schools. We know that South Australia is just about to roll out the Microsoft version of ChatGPT, which I think is called EduChat. They're going to roll that out to all the schools. It's happened in Ireland. It's happening in the UK. They're getting access to this at school level. We know it's having fundamental issues because there is increasing use of chatbots, increasing use of, as I mentioned earlier, for bullying and for not particularly nice purposes. But we're also seeing that employers are getting concerned about what skills those students are coming into the workforce with, the ones that are not going to university. So I'm going to leave it with two questions. Can we use generative AI or whatever technologies follow it? Because there is the argument that there'll be the bubble bursting and there's other technologies that will follow from it to help humans make higher education better in ways we can never imagine. This is not about not using AI. It is about using AI in a way that actually makes it better for the humans. So this is not a productivity argument. This is not an argument that we're using AI in order to fire people. What we're looking at is, can AI actually be used in ways to make humans better? And then can we use it as institutions to help us have the time and the capability to do the things that we should be doing in this complex environment, not focusing just on AI, but actually focusing on the major global challenges that we collectively research, teach, and debate about in universities. Because if we're not coming up with the solutions to those critical global and local challenges, we're not creating the capability of students to do it, where are these solutions going to come from? So we need to use the capability to have our ability to refocus on this again, to focus on the critical things for us. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Oh, sorry, I was just finding my unmute button. Thank you so very much, Peter. This was absolutely amazing. And I think you touched upon a number of issues that we have been grappling with ever since the AI has hit us in higher education. We just recovered from COVID, which was one major crisis, and now AI, another major crisis. And yeah, you've touched upon very fundamental issues. But what completely resonated with me, apart from how you unpacked authenticity, was that we need to bring back the fundamental challenges that we had been facing, irrespective of AI. So we need to bring those discussions back. So there are a number of comments that are coming in, and I'd really encourage anyone to unmute their microphone if they'd like to ask any question. But meanwhile, I have a question that I'm kind of grappling with. Now you talked about the third space. So there's polarity across the spectrum on the views of to use the AI or to not use the AI. And as you said, the majority of us are in that third space. However, what is happening is that there is a lot of push towards from the universities themselves. And as you said, it is the vendors who are ultimately getting the profit out of all this noise. So in several universities, including mine, there is sort of a push to use the commercialized version of the generative AI, and then you are kind of pushed towards showcasing how you're using AI within your classroom. So in a way, an educator's agency, as you said earlier, is kind of lost between these two polarized views. So how can we stay in this middle zone, in the third space, and at the same time maintain or regain our agency when the policies and the government and the vendors are pushing on in polarized ways?
Look, the abundant between is actually quite an uncomfortable space because it's a representation of probably the most overused word in academia, which is it's a liminal space. And the point about a liminal space, for the way it was constructed, was that it's a space you don't want to reside in.
Yeah.
But I've done a lot of research around sort of my discipline research, which is arts marketing, around people who actually feel comfortable in a liminal space. So part of the there's three things here that I think are really important. One is finding a community of people that actually are interested in what you're doing, because part of the reason the university is keen for you to present your successes in AI is that they're trying to form a community of AI success. And that's the way we tend to do technological adoption and have done that for decades in learning technology. So find a community of people, engage in critical debate, actually, and have those debates. Look, it's really important. Do I use AI? Yes, I do. Half the images in this thing were created using AI. I use AI in my creative practice. That's all fine. But I'm happy to have the debates with people about the ethics of it. I'm happy to have the debate. I got into a debate of mine from University of Art, a friend of mine from University of Arts London, about whether AI art is art. Now, and I agree with him, so it wasn't really a debate, it was really a conversation, that AI art isn't art because there's no creativity there, because AI can't be creative, because it is how it is interpreted and understood. And it's this whole thing about AI music and AI produced art and the like. But then there are artists who use AI in creative ways. So but having those debates is critical. And then the third thing is really being able to articulate the evidence base behind you. So
Yes.
do the research, have the evidence, And when I get into these debates, whether it's on social media or it's in conferences or doing this presentation or various other things, I make sure I evidence that debate, not just through my praxis, that's important, but also through rigorous business education, in my case, business education, but educational research, and backing it with the data that's behind it. Because there is data, there is research, and that research, like everything, has its polarized extremes. It's just
Yes.
finding where that rigorous debate occurs.
Yes, yes, and I think that is what is missing. It seems to be missing from the that community of practice within higher education, focusing more on the success stories rather than looking at it from skeptically, like critically. I was wondering, Alex, you've got some really great comments out there. Would you like to unmute yourself and ask Peter your comments?
Hi, sure. Hi. I worked for a little bit, so for context, I have my bachelor's in biomolecular science. I taught at my university briefly, as an academic tutor. This was way before the pandemic. And I now work in vocational adult education. Um, and so I know that with AI, because it's just a model, it's like any other thing. It's like when people are talking about computers, it's, it's only as good as the user. And I know that you can use AI and you can tell it to cite its sources, pull up the references, to do all that. Because I'm always resistant to use it personally, because I know that the environmental tax of it, for me, is not worth it.
Yeah.
And I always feel guilty if I ever do, because I know that it's the case of like my writing, I should be able to figure out this writing of, how to reword an email kind of thing, or reword stuff like that should, oh, sorry, the cat's behind me and jumping up behind me. Um, like that's a skill that I know I should be working on, and I try and use it minimally. But I know that there's a whole lot of stuff, at least US based, where, we're talking primary schools where it's AI generated textbooks, and it's, oh, there was no slavery in the US.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I find that there's an interesting stuff where you come in where it's the quality of the data that it's pulling from, and whether it is truly neutral and it can pull something that is critical, based obviously on what you're actually setting it up to do.
That's exactly right. And there's a wonderful piece by it's just about to come out in a journal by a guy who works at Data 51 in CSIRO, who talked about the amount of human intervention that is required on AI data, and how the more complex the process actually is, the more biases that AI introduces, and then the more human intervention that is required to check and validate that. And there's a point at which the human intervention is more time than it would have taken if the human did it themselves. And I'm really looking forward to that piece coming out, because he's put a preprint up. I'll see if I can find it. But he's put a preprint up, and it's really interesting the way he's done it. And it will be, I think, quite controversial when it comes out, because that's not the argument people are making. It's making that increasingly, the more AI is used, the less human intervention is required, because it reduces, regular sort of routine work. What I find interesting, I was literally just skimming this morning, the fact that there's a study that's just come out of Stanford that has pointed out that AI has inherent biases against working women. That was literally just released this morning. There's clear information that AI has biases against people of color. It has gender bias. The biases inherent in the training set, because it is primarily a US-based training set, also bring up frequent examples of US companies, US context, US law. There were some changes that ChatGPT had made at the base layer code, which I think was talked about this week, that ChatGPT is now banned from giving you legal and medical advice, because
that makes sense.
they were worried about the liability of it, clearly, but also the fact that it was giving advice that actually was potentially harmful. giving advice that was potentially, once again, driven by biases in data sets. It's quite, I mean, it's such a moving feast. And part of the problem we have is that AI is a black box. So at least we as academics, or anyone who's an academic, or anyone who teaches, knows your discipline and knows it well. And it's not a black box to us. But then when we use AI for these processes, we don't know how it's actually doing it. In fact, Sam Altman has said on a number of occasions that he doesn't know how the algorithm is actually doing what it's doing.
Yeah.
Now
That's
that could just be a
terrifying.
marketing hype from him. Terrifying, and then you've got, so to me, this whole thing is I'm using a tool that I don't understand how it works.
Mm.
And the anthropomorphization of it by people, and I've done it as well. How do you represent AI? You represent it as a smiling human robot. And it's not. What it is a giant data center, to your point, generating an enormous amount of environmental damage, using an enormous amount of water, and taking over huge swathes of lands in countries that could be used for other purposes. So there are these critical debates we have to have.
Yeah.
But in some ways, because we don't know how the box works, those debates are being had for us by the vendor.
Yeah, I found it actually really interesting when you were saying about how it ends up to counterbalance the inherent biases in the data sets, that the energy is, you might as well have just started it yourself. Because I remember when I was teaching and finishing my degree, because it was around the same time, that it was at the first kind of scandal of the essay writing websites where you could submit to get everything in, and it was kind of if you actually used it as it was intended, which was submit your question, get the evidence, get a version back, and then rewrite it. It's like the time it took you to do that, for you to do that, and to then have to analyze it and reassess it and redo things and not just hit click and submit, would be equivalent to just working on it yourself.
Exactly.
Because I knew one of my professors was like, I'm really tempted to sign up for some of those and write them and then see if any of my students submit them. I was like, you're an asshole.
Juliana, you have your hand raised.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yep.
All right. Hi, I'm Juliana, and I'm a senior learning advisor at Edith Cowan University. And I would like to touch on something that you mentioned, Peter, about using AI for feedback, because this is something that we've been actually doing here, just not in every single assessment and type of learning activity. But we believe that AI could give some kind of feedback to students that will facilitate their work or to progress, or at least to give them some kind of evidence of their learning in some cases. So I really would like to know from you what kind of activities you would think that would be appropriate to use AI. I'm really concerned about what you said about the explosion of, different things, like it's AI being trained by AI. So I wonder if the kind of feedback students will be getting will be like feedback that was learned from feedback. So that loop, it's just, so just would like to listen from you, what kind of use we can have from AI to get feedback from students.
Yeah, I think this is one of the, so, I took a fairly polarized position myself on this, where I strongly believe that there's particularly in the provision of feedback to students, there is very little place for AI. However, being realistic about it, there are things that AI feedback can do that ameliorate some of the problems that workload and administration have on us as academics. So things like immediacy of feedback. AI can provide immediate feedback. That's something which we know is of value to students. One of the reasons historically I've always allowed Turnitin to be open to students so that they can feed their work into Turnitin and get immediate feedback on whether they've attempted to, whether they haven't referenced correctly. And that immediacy, I think, is really, really interesting. there is something about it to do relatively simple tasks. You answered X to this mathematical question. The correct answer is Y. I can see how you got to X. Here's where the mistake happened. So where it's very black and white in the way the answer is constructed, right and wrong, however you want to look at it, that there's clear reasons why, and those actually are not too different from us having standard responses that we can drag and drop, or here is the correct answer, and here is how you get the 4 incorrect answers that are in the multiple choice. I can see that there is use for that because that is replicating existing models. It's just automating them. So that's another one of these arguments is it actually AI or is it actually automation? And are we just automating some of the processes we already do? Where we get into providing a rationale about an argument or a feedback on a personal reflection or feedback on how someone did something that isn't as objective as a set of criteria and that there is an element of subjectivity to it. That's where I have an issue with AI. So I do think there are uses. I don't design assessments that generally have those uses because I do a lot more sort of discursive kind of teaching. So for me, I won't have a use for it, but I can see where there are uses.
Thanks, Peter. There is one question by Hassan. And I think, Hassan, you're asking about how long do we need to continue the debate before we have a concrete policy around the use of AI and assessment of different nature, or are we going to stay fluid with this for much longer than we have experienced before?
That's a really good question. I think universities are attempting to make that certainty through policy. I certainly know my university is very deeply certain about what it's doing, and they're very public about that certainty. And I'm not critical of that because it does provide for academics. At least they know what they need to do in the redesign of their units. Where that certainty comes unstuck is the fact that the platforms keep changing. The practices keep changing. They're not getting better to the exponential degree that the promise is. The next change that we are going to have to try and move our way through is that there will be the bubble bursting. You know, there will be a dot-com burst that we had after the growth of the internet. There'll be something similar. These companies are capitalized to stupid figures. OpenAI is capitalized to over $500 billion with venture capital money. And part of the problem, at least with the difference, is that companies like Meta and Google all came up with a way in which they could monetize their capitalization. AWS, obviously Amazon moved into AWS and diversified. Google and Meta both became advertising companies. What's the way in which you monetize AI? Because user fees are not going to be enough to come back at $500 billion capitalization. So what is the way you capitalize that? And I think that's where the bust will happen, because there isn't at the moment a way to capitalize that. Now, maybe after the bust, they'll identify that every single post you get will have an inserted ad in it. So, you know, McDonald's might end up paying OpenAI to say, when you ask for examples of companies that do things, the McDonald's get the first example comes from them. That might be a way they are able to do it, but at the moment there isn't a way to capitalize it, and these companies are proliferating at a massive level, generating an enormous amount of venture capital funding. So I do think, Hassan, we have to wait for that, because whilst university policies move in a particular way, the actual structure that we are now relying on, which is not university architecture, is occurring outside of our control.
So, Peter, what's going to happen when the bubble bursts? What do you predict and say? 7 or 8 years'
I'm always
time.
hesitant to predict. I think like the internet boom and with other technology booms before it, it will eventually come down to a sort of much smaller group of companies. Now we already know how much Microsoft is investing in this. Apple is not walking away from AI, but it's not investing as much as
Yes, Microsoft.
as both Google and Facebook are doing so. I think you'll probably just end up with the construction of the industry back to, it'll probably just be Google, Oracle. It'll be the same companies delivering AI, and then they monetize it in the same way they've been monetizing it: data collection, users as product, and advertising.
Perfect. Matthew, is there any questions that I've missed?
No, I think you've been right on the mark. It's interesting, Peter, you're talking about the coming bust. The Gartner hype cycle is a thing.
Yep.
For those of us who have been around the ed tech space and the technology space for long enough, will see the patterns.
Yep.
I was just reflecting the other day that the Mag 7 are now at about 1/3 of the S&P 500, which was about where the last .com bust happened. So,
Yep.
We don't know
Yeah,
when.
I think it's going to be a fascinating thing to watch having been in ed tech for 30 years, watching this has happened numerous times. We take the whole MOOC crisis, the whole the rise of the internet and the change to online learning. There's been various waves of this for decades. It'll be fascinating to watch. I just don't want to watch it as a car crash, because that's
it'd be nice if it deflated smoothly, but that's not the way these things work, unfortunately. It's
the
never
way
worked
these
that
things
way.
work.
We've never
Never the
seen a
way
bubble
things work.
deflate, have we? It
No.
always just goes pop.
Yep. And then
But
what do
you're right in the
universities
sense
do
that,
who have backed themselves into some of these corners?
oh yes, the venture capital money train is going to run out at some point when they realize that Gen AI is 99% a bullshit engine, and that they have to really discover what a bullshit engine is actually useful for, and not a panacea to the world's problems.
And it does have use. There's no doubt about it, it has use.
Yeah.
But it's about finding what that use is, and that use isn't everything.
No, correct. Yes. Yeah. It's like all technology, isn't it? I mean, the internet didn't have the uses that people thought it was going to have. That people were investing in things like the .coms, as in the domain names, and then search engines came along and put a hole straight through that. So,
and then industries that were meant to be destroyed and transformed by the internet, music distribution and books are the two that I always use, have gone back to their physical artifacts, and actually those physical artifacts have more value because they do have meaning, and they are creative, and they are where people can believe in that. And there's that tactility and sense that comes from being in a bookstore or a record store, being both a book person and a record person.
well, look at the resurgence of vinyl records,
Exactly right. So what is it about higher education that is unique, that has that human sense of tactility and sense and believing? Because simply having a bot tell you how to do your maths homework is not the same as being in a class with with other people, online or face to face.
Yeah, it's the human connections you build up. It's the social networks. They're
100%.
often the success of your future career is the people you meet in higher education, and the personal connections, and you don't get that from a bot. You're right. Yeah.
100%.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much, folks. I think we're just about out of time. Brilliant. Thank you, Peter, and thank you, David, for coming along. Fantastic to listen to the different perspectives, and I think the threads of, your integrated assessments and the generative AI kind of come together to some extent. Particularly, we see TEXA, for example, has recommended programmatic style approaches as part of the pathway to dealing with the Gen AI conundrum, if we put it that way. So again, thank you very much, folks. Hopefully we will have another webinar probably in the new year. It is coming to the close of the academic year in Australia. So thank you very much, and hopefully we see you again next year.
Thank you so much, Peter. Thank you so very much, David. Thanks everyone for joining in. Thank you so much, Matthew.
Thank
Have a
you.
good day. Good night.
Peter, I enjoyed the hell out of that.
Thanks, David. Yours was great as well.
All right, I'm stopping the recording.
Thank you.